It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large with Warner Lewis. 60 minutes of smart talk radio with interesting guests from all walks of life begins right now. So sit back and enjoy. And now, from the flight deck, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment got a pretty serious subject here, but a good one indeed. It is certainly in the news. We're going to be talking about Russia. We're going to be talking about the Ukraine. We're going to be talking about Crimea with an expert indeed. We're going to be talking to Professor John Quigly. He's Professor Emeritus of International Law at Ohio State University, considered an expert on the subject, has also written a piece called Finding a Way Forward for Crimea for the Cambridge Journal of International and Comparative Law. Professor Quigly, how are you, my friend?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Appreciate having you spend some time with us today. This is a situation that obviously has the world's attention, certainly has the attention of the United States. I'll tell you what, though, I don't know the depth of background that we have to appreciate what really is going on there. If you would, could you please give our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit of a historical setup of the nature of the conflict and the relations that led to this?
Yes, I think that's a very important question because the way the whole situation has been handled by most of the media, it's kind of an us versus them with Russia, the United States issue. But there is background to it that is very important to understand what's going on. This is an area in the southern part of Russia that was originally part of the Ottoman Empire, and the peninsula of Crimea was inhabited largely by a group of people called Tatars who spoke a Turkish language. Their territory was more or less taken over in the late 18th century by Russia. The Russian Empire was expanding to the south, taking over territory from the Ottomans, and this was part of that general phenomenon. So from the late 18th century, the reign of Catherine the Great as empress in Russia, this territory became Russified. That is, Russians began moving in. It was a takeover, not unlike the takeover of the territory of the indigenous peoples of North America by Europeans. And from that time, the territory has been predominantly Russian. The relations with the Tatar people were never very good. When Germany came in the Second World War, Germany actually occupied for a time. The Tatar people were not unhappy with having Germany come in because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the Soviet government, once it was able to take the territory back in 1944 from Germany, decided to deport the Tatars and deported them en masse out to an area in Kazakhstan. And those people have been coming back in since the 1990s. So they constitute about a 15% minority of the population. But the predominant population remains Russian. There's a minority of Ukrainians as well. So it's a territory that has had a rather strange history historically. It was part of Russia. Then in 1954, the government of the Soviet Union decided to transfer it from Russia, from the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union, into the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union. So since that time, it's been part of Ukraine. That was not a big problem until the Soviet Union came apart, at which time the Russians were not happy about being under Ukraine. And there was concern back in 1992, 93, that there could be conflict over Crimea at that time, just as there was beginning to be conflict in other parts of the south of Russia, in particular in Chechnya. The Organization for Security and Cooperation, which is a European organization focusing on preventive diplomacy, got involved in the situation to try to forego any kind of hostilities as between Ukraine and Russia over Crimea. As it happens, the United States is a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and was involved in the efforts of preventive diplomacy. And as part of that effort, the State Department appointed me as what they call an expert to go there and to try to facilitate dialogue between the authorities in Crimea and the authorities in Kiev to try to come up with a solution that would be acceptable and would help prevent conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So I did that along with a couple of other people in 1994, and the Crimean authorities were quite strong in their representations to us about the situation. They said they didn't feel any reason that their country should be part of Ukraine. Their historical ties were with Russia, and they thought that should be the outcome. At that time, the Russian government was rather weak. This period just after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the Russian government was not willing to take on the Ukraine government over Crimea. So there at that time was not a possibility of Crimea joining Russia. That's what has changed as of now. Now the Russian government is willing to take Crimea in and is willing to bear the brunt of what it's now bearing from outside countries for doing that.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to talk to you about was Russia is under obviously extraordinary international pressure. Recently announced sanctions from the United States, putting even more economic pressure on it, political pressure from all over. What is the upside, so to speak, for Russia through all of this?
Well, I think that the Russian government feels that it needed to do this, in particular because of the change in government in Kiev, which brought into play some ultra-nationalist Ukrainian elements that sport Nazi symbols and talk kind of like neo-Nazis and are very negative towards the Russian population of Ukraine in general, the Russians of Crimea and Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine, where they also predominate. And I think that was seen as something of a challenge by Russia. In particular, that new government, this is the parliament of Ukraine, adopted a law that repealed a prior law that had said that the Russian language could be a second, but also official language in those parts of Ukraine where Russian is widely spoken. And that repeal was viewed by the Russian speakers and I think by the Russian government as an indication of a tendency in the newly formed government of Ukraine that would be very negative for the Russian-speaking population. So that, I think, is what prompted the fears. So Mr. Putin sees him as a protector of Russians, which is a very strong position for him in terms of domestic politics in Russia.
He is getting again. They're sort of coming off this sort of wonderful PR event in the Olympics, and now suddenly boiling out and underneath is this amazing confrontation that's going on here. Is this something, from your opinion, Professor Quigley, that you could see? Was this predictable?
Well, I think. I don't think I didn't predict. I don't think anyone predicted that that repeal of the language law would come about. I should add that ultimately the new president of Ukraine decided that repeal was such a bad idea that he vetoed it. So that has not gone into effect. But the fact that it was adopted by the parliament set this chain of events going. And I think there remains great concern on the part of the Russian speakers, despite the repeal of the law. So to that extent, I would say it wasn't predictable. But the whole scenario, that is the fact of Crimea being part of Ukraine, that, as I say, has been problematic now for over 20 years. When I was working there, I initially, explored the possibility that Crimea could become part of Russia, but as I say, at the time, it didn't seem politically feasible. So what I worked on was a plan to try to create an autonomy for Crimea within Ukraine that would have some real teeth in it, in particular that would have international oversight of the autonomy situation. I wasn't able to get that through. There was a kind of autonomy instituted for Crimea, but without international oversight under the Constitution of Ukraine.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. I got a good one going this segment. We're talking Professor Emeritus of International Law at Ohio State University, John Quigley, long considered an expert in Soviet Ukrainian relations. Professor Quigley, as far the United States, let's talk about the United States' stake in this and how much of it is real and how much of it is sort of imagined or just political posturing.
Well, I don't see that it matters that much to the United States whether Crimea is part of Ukraine or is part of Russia. In a way, it could be to the advantage of the United States if Crimea is part of Russia, in that reduces the Russian element within the overall population of Ukraine and makes it more likely that Ukraine is going to be able to align with the West, with the European Union in particular, because the opposition in Ukraine to that affiliation with the West comes largely from the Russian speakers in the eastern part of the country, and taking Crimea out reduces the percentage of Russian speakers.
What, as you look back, and again, for you, it has been now, some 20 years since you were there. Fundamentally, from where you sit, if you were to go back, what would impress you has changed dramatically?
Well, I think the basic scenario there has not changed very much. You still have the Tatar population. The Tatar population now is not happy with what's going on. I mean, there are reports of rejoicing in the streets of Crimea over the affiliation with Russia, but that comes from the Russian speakers. I think that there needs to be some focus by the international community on the situation of the Tatars, just to make sure that their rights are maintained, not that the Russian government has done anything overt that would indicate that they're planning to mistreat them. But those people do have concerns based on the history of the relationship. And I think it would be very helpful if the United States and the European Union would raise that issue with the Russian government. Instead they're going through the sanctions war which I don't see as having any useful outcome.
What and again, I go back to are probably the average American's lack of understanding, lack of appreciation, not only of the history but of the motivations behind all of this. And again, as this show, as you and I were talking, as of this date, recently announced sanctions against a broader brush of Russian citizens, certain Russian officials, of course, and some of the sanctions against them. Do you see this being at all effective? I guess what I'm trying to do is, where's the break point for Russia? Where do they come to the table, or when do they begin to sort of withdraw or pull back a little bit from some of the intensity here?
Well, I don't think it's likely that the Russian government will pull back from Crimea. What the pressure may result in is keeping Russia from doing anything further, although, frankly, I don't really see that as a realistic possibility in the first place. So I think that Russia is likely to continue with the affiliation of Crimea to Russia, and that's not likely to change. So I suppose we're going to have this kind of standoff with the sanctions. I don't think the sanctions are going to influence the Russian government in any significant way. I think they're willing to put up with whatever financial loss may be involved.
What do you see the world community, are they, from where you sit, do you see the world community beyond the United States and some of our closest allies becoming more involved, more concerned, joining in, or are they going to remain on the sidelines?
Well, it's mainly Europe. I think outside Europe, there's just general mystification over the fact that this has gotten to be such a major confrontation. The European governments, I think, would like to have a closer affiliation with Europe, but I think at the same time they're not so willing to confront Russia as is the United States, because the European countries have a much closer financial relationship with Russia. But ultimately, I think something needs to be worked out whereby Ukraine can have some ties with the West, but also maintain ties with Russia, because the economies of Ukraine and Russia are rather closely tied up. I mean, it just makes sense because of the geographic proximity, the sharing of oil resources, in particular, the fact that there's a great deal of industrial development in eastern Ukraine, which in fact was the main industrial element within the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union existed, and that connection has continued even after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I don't see a complete divorce between Russia and Ukraine as being likely.
Well, I did want to go back and explore a little bit again in your time over there some 2 decades ago. You were, again, would you remind us again your role over there and the purpose of the mission?
Well, I was appointed as what is called an expert to come up with ways of getting the two parties together. This was under the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is an international organization that includes most of the European countries, plus Canada and the United States. And they have what they call a High Commissioner for National Minority Issues, that is, for issues that involve ethnic conflict within a state of Europe where the ethnic conflict is considered to be of such magnitude that it might lead to open hostilities. And it was under the office of that High Commissioner that I and 2 other people, one a lawyer from Italy and one an economist from Germany, were appointed as experts. And our mandate was to facilitate dialogue. So we went there and examined the situation, got an idea of what was going on, talked with all the parties, talked with the officials in the Ukrainian government, talked with the officials in the Crimean government. We were in the parliament of Crimea. You may have seen on TV, shots of that parliament chamber. That's the chamber where we were functioning at the time we were there. We then organized a major conference on the issue in 1995 in Switzerland. That is, the Organization for Security and Cooperation brought together officials from Ukraine and Crimea in a hotel in Switzerland to try to get them to talk together to work things out. And I was largely the facilitator of that meeting. And as I say, the result was that a situation of autonomy was created within the law of Ukraine for Crimea, and that was an outcome that was not entirely satisfactory to the population of Crimea, which, as I say, would have preferred a separation from Ukraine.
You recently wrote a piece called "Finding a Way Forward for Crimea" for the Cambridge Journal of International and Comparative Law. And I'm curious as to, from where you sit and with the body of work that you've done, what are realistic scenarios going forward? How could this play out?
Well, there does need to be some accommodation with Ukraine over Crimea. At the moment, the fuel, the physical fuel that is used in Crimea comes through Ukraine, and Ukraine does have the only land connection to Crimea. It's a very narrow strip of land. There's no land connection to Russia. So something needs to be worked out so that there can be a kind of modus vivendi between Crimea and Ukraine, even as I think Crimea will remain, as it is now, a part of Russia. There's also the Ukrainian population, a minority within Ukraine, and I don't know to what extent those people will remain, but to a large extent I think they will. There's intermarriage. There's not really that much difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians, so you have many families where one spouse is Ukrainian, the other spouse is Russian, and something needs to be worked out for them. In the immediate term, the situation of the military people from Ukraine needs to be worked out because there's some of them still on their bases in Ukraine, and they're in a very difficult situation because the Ukrainian government is not evacuating them, but is kind of leaving them there. But the Ukrainian government is obviously not planning a military action to try to retake Crimea. So those people are stuck there, and I would hope that can be worked out without any violence.
Well, it is complicated. It is deep-seated. It is one that probably, I would guess, is not going to resolve itself tomorrow. And in a timeline, is there such a thing as a full resolution here, or does it just sort of evolve and over time?
Well, I don't think you're going to get a solution that's satisfactory to everybody. The Ukrainian government, I think, is going to have to come to the realization at some point that they're not going to have Crimea, at least in the short term. I mean, nothing is forever in politics, but I don't see that as changing in the short term. And I think it would be helpful if there could be focus on the issue of protecting the minorities within Crimea. And in fact, that issue is being raised by some people in the Ukrainian government. I mean, they understand that going forward is going to be critical.
Well, we have been talking to Professor John Quigley, Professor Emeritus of International Law at Ohio State University, long known as an expert in the area of Russia, the Soviet Union, the Ukraine, Crimea, and relations there. Again, as we've been talking, it is not something that is simple. It's something that has deep, deep historical roots. Professor Quigley, how can people find out more about this situation and maybe some of the work and writings that you've done?
Well, you mentioned the piece that I wrote in the Cambridge Journal of International and Comparative Law. That's posted on a website out of the UK, University of Cambridge. That's, of course, very, very brief. It doesn't give the whole historical background. But in fact, there isn't really a great deal written about it. I myself haven't written very much in detail about the situation historically of Crimea, but it is covered in general histories. So there is something that can be followed there. The major media in this country, I think, haven't given a good account of the whole situation. So if you just Google Crimea, I'm afraid that what you find is going to be a bit thin.
Well, we will count on our Lewis at Large listeners to use their erudite skills and find out more. Listen, thank you so much for sharing your observations today, and again, thanks so much for your insight.
Thank you very much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.